Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ned Miller. I'm the Vice President of CrowdStrike's Federal Business Unit. Welcome to the CrowdStrike Federal Podcast Series. Today, we're going to be talking more about threat hunting as it relates to Zero Trust. And joining me today is Scott McGregor, one of our senior architects from our Department of Defense team. And Scott, why don't we just jump in and get started? Now, you and I have been speaking for some time now about how DoD is evolving its threat hunting capabilities and what I would consider its business across the cyber mission force, hunt forward operations, to include some of the recent activity with their partner ecosystems, how the regional cyber centers react to threat hunting, and even down to the CPT teams. So we've had some fairly healthy conversations about this. And today I'm looking forward to digging into some of the details and getting your perspective, given your background. Is it fair to say, Scott, that over the years that you've worked with almost all the stakeholders that I just mentioned across DoD, to include the management and kind of the operator level, and specifically the teams and operators doing the actual hunting investigations, you've had quite a bit of experience working with those folks and have a somewhat of a unique perspective to offer back out to our audience?
Thanks, Ned. Yeah, I have. I have been working with the DoD for over 20 years. I've seen many of the evolution of the DoD Cyber Mission Force from the early years when we were just IT, struggling to identify assets, deploying sniffers, deploying some basic things just from the IT side, to later defined computer network defense with the SOCs and the early JTF GNO days. I've had that opportunity to work with many different groups, including unique DoD agencies deploying open source tooling, all the way to the modern flyaway CPT teams. Something I've noticed was that there's always been a challenge with understanding the exact threats to the boundary of the network, the assets that are on those networks, and gaining that rapid context collection and being able to quickly respond to those threats were key all throughout those years in successful operations. So it's important that we dive into that as we progress through the Zero Trust pillars.
Very good, Scott. And, as we prepared for this conversation today, we talked a lot about the business model around cyber threat hunting. And the reality is that it's still very unbalanced when you view it from the lens of reactive versus proactive. So going forward with today's conversation, I'm going to see if I can't provoke some critical observations from your perspective and perhaps focus this next question on why is that? Why in general is cyber hunting so reactive? How has the model evolved to the point that those of us that work with the defenders and those operators in those cyber hunting arenas and the defenders in particular, why is it so reactive?
It's an interesting view. It goes back historically too, where detection is far easier than actual protection. And so seeing the detections and then having to figure out how to proactively move forward has been a challenge. We've had technologies that have been deployed over the years where we take things like network protections, such as IDSs, and we migrate those into IPSs. So identity detections versus protections. But it's even harder than that because often the threat hunter is looking at data after the fact, right? And we're trying to piece it back together. In the case of partner networks, we might have to place new or integrate existing technologies long after the original compromise, and sometimes even post-breach, right? And so these techniques are limited when not placed in the correct locations, and the threat hunter is left with a lack of context. And so just to kind of dive into some of these different approaches that you were talking about is, we can take a look at things through the lens of indicator-based detection, those IOCs. These are the traditional hashes and fingerprints of known previous attacks. We have signature-based detections. These are your SNORD and YARA rules. They're weak in the face of polymorphic malware. They're weak in the face of living off the land techniques because you can easily bypass those signature-based detections. Then, we've kind of migrated to things like aggregation-based detections. And so you see those appear in SIMs and data lakes. And they're great for collecting data, but again, you often lose context to make the proper decision in a time. And so the longer it takes for you to make that decision, the further away from protection you get, and you start really getting into a reactive state. We've gone through some experimental deployments of things like anomaly behavioral based detections, the UEABAs, and they're excellent when they're already in place and at scale, but they're really difficult to get right. And they often require months or years worth of learning and very stable networks. And within the DoD, being able to be mobile, being able to be agile, being able to react, tear down a network, create a new network, that becomes very hard in situations like that. Threat intelligence-based detections are another thing that we talk about. We use CTI today. It's great for understanding the adversary, but again, it may lack your ability to make a decision proactively. So you can understand what happened, but you still have to learn what may happen and be able to have pre-placed positioning on that. And then the final kind of piece of that would be forensic-based detections, which happen in the incident response phase. Those are deep imaging and forensics. They're very slow and methodical. They're absolutely needed for legal and attribution purposes, but they're not fast enough to respond to the threat.
Yeah, Scott, it seems as though there were two variables in there that you talked about that continuously trouble and challenge our defenders today. And that's really the concept of time is certainly not on our side. As we see the dwell time shrinking to, we're now measuring it in hours. We used to measure it in days and months. And I think it's really important for our audience to get laser focused on the concept of modernizing cyber threat hunting. And we're going to talk a lot as we go through today's discussion about ways in which to do that. But I've got now kind of a two-part question for you. We're going to start to dive into this. So your answer on the reactive nature of cyber hunting was a great segue and transition into what specific actions can be done to allow DoD in particular to expand and or accelerate perhaps the way it proactively detects indicators of attacks and some of the things that you mentioned much faster and sooner. And we'll get into some architectural questions as we go, but what's your initial reaction? How can they become more effective and efficient in hunting based on what we understand about the landscape today?
Yeah, Ned. So one of the things that we really have to look at is, operationalizing AI and ML enabled tools and getting that hunting deployed to the edge of the enterprise with cloud-based infrastructures, meaning we actually run the tools on the endpoints, right? But back that architecture with cloud-based tools so that you can scale, you can really manipulate and maneuver wherever you need to and deploy very quickly. So the only way to get left of the breach is to have a data-centric approach, right, to this threat hunting using the AI and ML, right? And that'll augment instead of what's happening over in the traditional SIM and data lakes, right? So looking hard at those pre-placed defenses, adding additional context so that we have that data-driven security is really important. So traditionally, these pre-placed defenses were only at the boundaries, or they were small-scale legacy AV. So the boundary defenses I'm talking about are IPSs and these firewalls. And neither of these were able to scale to the modern adversary. So today we see things such as network threat response, we see things as EDR and XDR and a lot of additional technologies. But it's not just layering the technologies or adding new or ripping out old ones. It's understanding where they're actually placed and being able to place them very specifically and quickly in the correct locations prior to having breaches. And it's the rise of the edge, the fall of the traditional boundary that have made it difficult to protect the enterprise. And it's the adversary being able to exploit this lack of edge defense, the lack and the false sense of boundary security that we still inherit from 15 years ago. The DoD still has a fairly strong edge compared to most commercial enterprises, but every day that edge falls closer and closer to the endpoint. And there's many endpoints that are at that edge, right? That endpoint is the edge of the nipper. That endpoint is where security will fail, right? And so having that understanding of where the adversary is looking at, and not just nation state, but criminal intent and insider threat, right? The adversary could be anyone, that's trying to gain access to your data and use that data for their own purpose. So the boundary security is not enough. We need to really focus on zero trust infrastructures that can look at the problem from the perspective of the adversary and get down to the edge quickly and in a scalable manner.
Yeah, great. And again, you just kind of set me up for part two of the question. You touched a bit on the architecture and some of the challenges that we have seen, and you and I have been in this space for quite some time combined. Some of the challenges that we have seen is the architecture that exists across DoD is specifically designed very differently than a lot of the commercial enterprises that we've come across. And candidly and transparently, we can only take the conversation so far, but let's say that's by design. Now, you implied that our particular architectural approach could add some significant benefits to help the defenders move a little bit more quickly, specifically as it relates to, in this context, adversarial hunting, and be able to inform the likes of a cybercom or a regional cyber center or even the CPTs. So can you touch on a little bit more about the potential architectural advantage that we're now seeing with modern approaches leveraging the cloud that may be an interesting approach to help our friends on the DoD side modernize the thinking and the implementation of threat hunting?
I certainly can, but I want to cue in on one little thing too, is that the architecture of the adversary has changed too, especially in the nation state adversary. Many years ago, you would go back and it would be a single piece of malware. It would be a single piece of malware with a single callback domain. Or they might have had things like configure or other things where they had random DNS names. But they're fully able to leverage like cloud security architectures in the nation state space. They can deploy very large scale, hundreds of servers supporting their backend needs to target a singular individual. So what that means is that speed is important, right? Not only in the aspect of scaling to address, the adversary, but also to be able to get the security down to the endpoint, right? Being able to make decision loops down low on the edge and have deeper decision loops that go up to the cloud. One way to address this, right? Problem is for us to use cloud native architecture and SaaS-based solutions, being able to quickly procure, quickly create, and leverage these multi-tenant solutions that exist today that are available at cloud scale and are secure. So if you're constantly needing to update your architecture and your tools, you're not able to focus on the mission, right? So legacy architecture that doesn't scale when faced with these modern adversaries is a serious problem. And that's something that needs to be addressed. At CrowdStrike, we use extremely large data platforms, but we use them in a way that maintain context with collection points, right? I've been approached multiple times, so just as like an insight, I've been approached multiple times from DoD and other entities where they tell me, hey, I have got this big data platform. I've got this large data lake. I've already got the information. Sell me the silver bullet ML AI model to throw in my big data platform to spit out new decisions. And the answer is, can't really do that. You might have some minor success in it, but context is the key, and the ability for the data lakes to continue to communicate with the endpoint, with the edge, and have and leverage the modern infrastructures that we have today so that we can make timely decisions rather than make disconnected reactive decisions. So proactively, we want to be able to twiddle the bit when we think something is coming. When an ML makes a decision, we can proactively make changes if we're actively connected to the endpoint. But when data lakes are very far away, when they're multi-tier up, it's very hard to reach back.
Yeah, Scott, it's a great point. We are starting to use the term velocity a lot more when it comes to cybersecurity. And when you talk about data lakes and the concept of scraping log files, it just, it's like hearing a bad sound on a chalkboard every time I get into one of those conversations where people ask me the same question. Hey, can we just have your AI and ML models and we'll overlay it on our data set? The reality is we've been doing this for over a decade now and have revised the approach to the telemetry data, that we're not only looking at the volume where we're seeing trillions of events across our sensor grid, we're also looking at other important indicators from our incident response teams, from our adversary teams that are looking at the top 200 of the worst, and incorporating all of that real time into our security cloud. So there's a lot more to it than just data mining, if you will. I think is one of the key points there. Thank you for that perspective. So with that, we had some news recently that was announced just a couple days ago that our CrowdStrike Falcon platform just achieved IL5. We received our provisional ATO. As you're aware, one of our primary go-to-market value propositions now with our Clade native platform is for us to directly focus on one of the areas you touched on, adversarial threat hunting. So from your perspective, again, you work with a lot of the folks that are operators that have to do this for a living day in and day out. What unique advantages do you believe we, CrowdStrike, can offer our DoD cyber operators as it relates to hunting, but specifically helping them be able to look around corners by leveraging our adversarial approach, plus all the other telemetry data that we do capture?
Right. And Ned, the amount of telemetry that we capture is unprecedented. We have an absolute immense commercial deployment, and we have a very large number of clouds that support those. And we're able to bring this information and really crowd scale it internally so that we can address these problems. One of the other things that we'll bring to the table, as I said before, is speed. And speed is the important aspect of scaling. And so speed of deployment, speed of detection, speed back to the core operating systems to perform their mission, right? I don't know how many times I've had issues on said networks where it takes a very long time for those machines to turn on. And it's due to the legacy ways that the hooks are in those systems, and being able to use a single lightweight agent that can collect once and perform multiple different functions on top of it is truly important. Our IL5 implementation will allow the defenders to focus on the mission and not the infrastructure as well, right? They'll get the integrated threat intelligence, the ability to use AI and ML directly on the endpoint, as well as closed loops with the cloud. An important aspect of that tool, like I said, is to do that collection once and use it multiple times. And another really interesting thing that we're able to do is gain this passive understanding of the applications and the data and the environment that these systems live on, right? And provide that, to new technologies without slowing down the warfighter's ability to use the platform.
Great, Scott. Thank you. So as we get deeper into the conversation here, again, I promised that the conversation and the questions would get a little bit more interesting. Another two-part question for you. So you mentioned AI and ML a number of times during the opening comments here as we've gotten into this a little bit further. I think our audience would be disappointed if we didn't talk a bit about AI as part of the conversation today. The media and the vendor community clearly have all kind of jumped on the train here talking about AI. The last 6 months has proven interesting, watching the conversation around AI for good versus AI for evil. Even our own CEO, George Kurtz, was in an interview the other day, and he was asked the question about adversarial AI, which I think requires further definition. But from your lens, our lens, as it relates to cybersecurity in particular, how would you define adversarial AI for our listeners today, and perhaps position the second part of the question that I have right after that? But what's your thought on adversarial AI as we know it today?
Adversarial AI or ML can be a complex topic, but let me just kind of give you a definition of it. So adversarial machine learning and artificial intelligence is the process of extracting information about the behavior and characteristics of the machine learning model or system and manipulate those inputs into the system to obtain a preferred outcome, right? So adversarial generally means I'm attacking the AI or the ML in some sense. Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm using AI for nefarious purposes. That's another topic, but it's also very interesting. But defining the AML, the adversarial machine learning, right? That's a mouthful. So let me break it down a little bit more, right? So AI is used in the news every day, from the large language models, the LLMs, to AI assistants. We talk about how AI is trained and how ML and neural networks like deep learning from generation 2 and generation 3 affect our lives and security. So we have used in cyber for years, models with 2 to 5 layers of convolutional neural networks. These are the basic neural networks. And then some techniques have been used with complex hundreds of layers, and then we layer on supervised learning. So we continue to progress through generation 2 into generation 3 with additional neural networks and ANNs. There's lots of terminology around that. We've all heard about, the chat GPTs, and the tech industry and even the analysts can't get enough of chat GPT, right? From a day-to-day usage, it has phenomenal ability to really help you if you understand its output and if you understand that the output that it's giving is not necessarily correct, right? But these big LLMs we see in the media, right, were trained with scrape data from things like Twitter or Reddit, Wikipedia, and other conversational data sources and code sources. And I have to say that supposedly because we don't know exactly where they were trained from. Although they understand language constructs and positioning, they may not understand the actual language. And they'll definitely not understand the military context of the use, right? So these sources don't reflect truth. They reflect chained information that may provide assistance to an operator, to an analyst, to a hunter, but it's rather lacking in explainability. So adversarial AI can happen, going back to adversarial AI, it can happen in 2 different main ways. So we have what are called white box attacking and black box attacking. White box attacking actually means that somebody from the inside, a bad actor, has access to our model or our training set. So if I am pulling data from someplace and I'm trying to automatically learn information, I can learn bad information. And learning that bad information is that white box attacking of the adversarial AI. Black box means that the bad actor has access to my model or can target my model so that when it's used in production, they're not detected, or the piece of information that they're giving it gets falsely classified. So if everything that I do requires machine learning and AI, there are ways to attack it. And one of the ways that we can mitigate that is by rotating ML models and having multiple different ML models and actors that look at the data in different ways. So that's just one of the problems that we have with ML AI today. Obviously there's a lot more. AI needs to be robust and have more awareness on how those decisions are made. So we call that explainable artificial intelligence. There's a lot in the news about that recently. These vulnerabilities to attack the adversarial AI, unwanted harms, the safety risks, right? So there are conversations where when you're training an AI, it may take a novel way to approach a solution because it is only being paid in points when it gets an appropriate answer. But that novel way that it's going to it, or creative way that it's going to it, could be very damaging or harmful. Take, for instance, in cybersecurity, it could take machines offline or take entire networks offline just to turn off one machine. And that may not reflect the need of what you want for your environment. So, as we progress through the iterations of ML and AI, and we deploy these models throughout the endpoints and networks, we have to be very aware of what's going on. And so in the future, we'll find that chained actors in our AI will provide not one voice, but multiple pathways for an operator, right? So these actors will be similar to subject matter experts that deliver guidance to operations, and that the operator then can make decisions based on those subject matter experts. And that's one of the ways that we're looking at utilizing it in CrowdStrike as well.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. There's a lot to unpack there. One of the key things that I picked up on during your comments was the fact that we have been using AI and learning models, machine learning models for over a decade, as I mentioned. And you probably even coined some new phrases in there that I'll be able to repurpose for future podcasts. But the concept of multiple levels of AI being leveraged in almost a moving target defense concept, except we're moving our AI and learning models all the time, so they're not necessarily or don't become necessarily an exposure point to someone to compromise the actually learning the behavior. So very interesting point. We could probably talk about that for hours. So Scott, part two of the question is, CrowdStrike recently announced our AI capability that'll be made generally available here shortly, technology that we refer to as Charlotte AI. Love the name. For those that are keeping track of CrowdStrike and following our podcast series and some of our recent advertising, you may recall we introduced Charlotte at one of our Super Bowl ads as a character. So as we have announced Charlotte AI, Scott, we talked about a few use cases that were outlined as part of the announcement. One was related to threat hunting. So now that we've kind of done the deep dive into AI and we've introduced Charlotte AI, how might Charlotte change the game in terms of using AI for the advantage for our defenders? We talked about, potentially it being used for evil, as we say, or by the adversary. So how does this now change the game for us to go from more of a reactive state to a proactive state at scale? Thoughts?
Yeah, Charlotte's really interesting. She was kind of dropped on us too. And when they started explaining to us how Charlotte works on the back end, we started getting some really interesting insights, and there was a lot of excitement internal in the company. But really for this, it's using AI to gain time back to the threat hunter. The Charlotte is able to provide numerous insights into the data and provide a more robust understanding of that data. It can help leverage normalized information that you might get out of an LLM, but protect the data so it doesn't get shared out. But then fuse it with your internal data, and then also provide an insight on how you might go about using our product better. So combining those three different things is similar to what I was talking about, which is chaining these different actors together to get a good voice out of an AI system. You can use Charlotte. It can use multiple different kinds of data sources to provide a way for faster decision making. The idea is, if you're not an expert in a particular function of tools, you can get the AI to help you generate a response and guide you to the next step. So take, for instance, if I need to craft a quick search for a particular threat actor from a nation state, I could use the AI to help me identify who is actually targeting me and my industry, help me craft that search, and then I could use that search to find the threat. It could also point out, hey, you could save this and you could continually search for this target or this threat vector. I could also use the AI to help craft an indicator of attack, and then use that IOA in combination with the real-time response mitigation to automatically remediate threats. Charlotte AI is a game changer for us, and it will really help the warfighter get back to the mission faster than ever before.
Great, Scott. And we have talked about, automation quite a bit as we've transitioned here into, how we can leverage AI and ML even greater than what's actually occurring today. So let me ask you another two-part question. The Defense Department, is very focused on zero trust, as we all know. During several of our recent discussions that you and I have had internally, as we've been positioning CrowdStrike for alignment to the DoD zero trust maturity models, we started these discussions at how do we align best to help accelerate DoD's timetable. And during one of our sessions, you talked about, and I think we gave you credit for this term internally, zero trust hunting at the edge. So, two-part question: what do you mean by that? And part two: how can CrowdStrike really begin to position this new concept of hunting at the edge? And as it becomes a reality that DoD is going to have to deal with, how would you describe we best position ourselves?
Sure. So zero trust hunting at the edge is a concept that I was kind of working on for a while. The idea is that we need to look at the core pillars of zero trust: the users, the data, the workload, the network, the devices, but all in the context of predictive hunting. So instead of looking at IOCs and reactive hunting, we score the items in the pillars, like those individual users and devices, in the context of usage and, importantly, where the adversary interest may lay. So scoring it gives us a insight for hunting and gives us tips on where we should be looking at threats. So in cybersecurity, we've attempted this in the past with things like user entity behavior analytics, as well to create things like label VIP asset in the past, but we've not been able to do it at scale. And we've not been able to do it in any form of passive manner. It normally required a very heavy amount of configuration and learning on the endpoint. So moving toward a zero trust model where each individual piece is understood and scaled and scored, we can maintain context and we can understand that beyond just a simple POV, that working with multiple modern products, not just CrowdStrike, we should be able to state with a degree of confidence that there's a particular user is a VIP, that data that they're accessing is also important, and that this activity and that data is also being targeted by adversaries in the historical context. So doing it not at one time or making one bucket of this information, but the idea is to do this continuously so that when you hunt, you're able to hunt in real time in a proactive manner. And that allows like those DoD pillars of zero trust with predictive hunting technologies to protect the enterprise in a new way.
Great, Scott. And you set up the next question I have, and many of our audience members, I suspect, have as well. Again, focused on zero trust, specifically threat hunting. And we've talked about this internally. We've talked about it. I've personally spoken to DoD CIO, the DoD CISO, the PMO office for DoD's zero trust initiatives. We've talked about these DoD zero trust maturity models and specifically categories that we CrowdStrike can help them as we're talking about threat hunting and how to enable it. And you hit on a couple of keywords here. So as I've positioned it with some of the authoritative sources within the department, we've talked a lot about visibility, observability, and continuous monitoring, which is what you talked about. All of this seems to align very well to the department's desired future state, right? Of having these advanced capabilities by 2027. Seems to me that given all we've talked about here today, we can help accelerate their timetables. Would you agree with me? And it's okay for you to disagree in this case.
No, certainly I do agree. I think enhancing the observability of the edge is key to getting down the path of the zero trust maturity model. And one vendor can't do it all, right? CrowdStrike's not going to be your sole solution to do anything. We don't believe any vendor should be the sole vendor that does everything for you, from your operating system to your architecture to your security. That wouldn't solve your zero trust problem. That would just exacerbate it. We need to look at the problem from the edge, forward through the perspective of the adversary, getting to the understanding the zero trust means that we observe how every person, device, and data set is connected to each other in a timely and scalable manner. So those scaled deployments, the flexible architectures are key to getting it to the desired future state.
Perfect. Scott, today we've mostly talked about cyber threat hunting. You touched on a little bit of cyber threat intelligence, and we talked about specifically how CrowdStrike kind of tracks the 200 plus of the worst known bad actors, if you will. We're laser focused on who we believe are the sophisticated adversaries. They have dedicated teams. We have dedicated teams, hundreds of resources, helping organizations understand the goals of the adversary and their behaviors and their TTPs or tactics, techniques, and procedures. We're tracking e-crime, nation state, hacktivists, cyber threat actors. What are your thoughts on why cyber threat intelligence can be so valuable as a key component of both a proactive cyber threat hunting program and a key component to a zero trust outcome? That zero trust and cyber threat intel isn't necessarily called out in the zero trust model, but it seems to me that the two go hand in hand. If you're serious about threat hunting, your threat intelligence program has to be as robust as your threat hunting capability and the architecture to do so. Thoughts?
Yeah, I've used CTI for many, many years. And from the early days of very low quality, some basic telemetry, GeoIP lookups, right, to, our classified data sets that we had, and then dealing with the challenge of operationalizing those classified data sets down to an operator. But really, with sophisticated attacks moving quickly and becoming more evasive, stopping modern breaches require the right data and the rich context and the ability to move faster than the adversary. So high fidelity CTI, such as Falcon Threat Intelligence, can be the engine that provides that rich context and solves the community's challenges. Like, for CTI sources to be valuable, they need to be able to correlate millions of telemetry data sources like we do from across the world and place it in the hands of the cyber warfighters in a digestible and actionable format. CTI is more than providing just IOCs, like files, hashes, IP addresses, and a simple MITRE ATT&CK chart. When you select a CTI provider, they should share indicators and data that is collected in near real-time speeds, provide a variety of reports, including periodic reports and daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, publish alerts to notify relevant cyber events, and technical analysis reports, that can be 30, 40 pages that provide information such as attack techniques and those kill chain analysis and full malware reverse engineering. I believe that the quality of the CrowdStrike CTI provides a decision advantage to the network defenders and policymakers that keep them ahead of the adversary. And that's why I really like the CrowdStrike threat intelligence. And it's such a key portion of what I utilize every day in my threat hunting when I'm going about doing it within POV environments.
Great, Scott. And I know it's such a critical component, an enabler for those that leverage our platform. And now the Department of Defense has the ability to do so as well. Many of the Department of Defense customers that we have today, as you know, are cyber threat intel customers. Now they'll have the ability to leverage our platform to become more proactive and round out their threat hunting capabilities and really start to get into the visibility, observability, and proactive continuous monitoring piece, which is where we'd like to see us be able to position and help the defenders accelerate that time variable that we've talked about. Scott, this is the part where I ask you my favorite question. So kind of king for a day. So if you had 3 recommendations for our audience on perhaps how to modernize their cyber threat hunting programs, what would your top 3 must-do actions or takeaways be?
There's a couple different things, and I'll give you 3. The number one thing is ensure that you do not lock into a single vendor. For the operating system architecture and security, we want to increase our flexibility and our ability to do layered defenses. That's 1. 2, you should ensure that you have a rapidly deployable, easily scalable, and flexible pre-placed defenses that understand the environment. I think that's incredibly important, and it's actually really hard to do if you choose the wrong vendors. And then thirdly, ensure that you have context-rich and data-centric approaches to threat hunting, utilizing everything that we have from AI to ML to augment the traditional roll-up capabilities that we have and the historical things that we have within our SIMs and our data lakes.
Great, Scott. Thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Would like to thank our audience for listening in to this particular episode, as well as our sponsor, CarahSoft, for supporting the effort. We look forward to continuing the CrowdStrike Federal Podcast series. Next up, we'll be talking more about adversarial AI. As you can imagine, it's a hot topic, and will continue to be more pervasive in conversations going forward. Thank you again very much. And again, my name is Ned Miller. I'm the Vice President of CrowdStrike Federal. Thank you for joining.